Welcome to the Floyd Memorial Library podcast, a window into the soul of the North Fork of Long Island. We'll delve into the pulse of our community, its pressing issues, promising opportunities, and the rich stories that weave our shared history. I'm your host, Christopher Bianchi, and for episode 95, we sit down with Heather Lanza, director of Southold Town's Planning Department. She brings a lifetime of experience in land preservation and urban planning to our conversation. Growing up in Massachusetts and pursuing her studies in college, Heather found her passion for planning and conservation. Her journey took her to Long Island, where she started with the Nature Conservancy in East Hampton, and then later working for Brookhaven Town before becoming Southold's planning director in 2007. Heather shares insight from her time developing Southold's comprehensive plan and sheds light on the department's role in guiding Southold's growth. From zoning to planning and the development process, we'll explore the evolving future of Southold and how its strategic planning can shape the community for generations to come. So I hope you enjoy episode 95 with Heather Lanza. This episode was recorded July 11th, 2024. Thank you so much for coming on to the Floyd Memorial Library podcast today. I'm really looking forward to talking to you.
Oh, you're welcome. I'm excited to talk to you about all of this.
And now I'd like to just start off with if you could give us a little introduction about yourself, where you were born and raised.
Sure. Well, I was born and raised in Southbridge. It's a small town in central Massachusetts.
And could you tell me about your parents and where are they from and their professions?
Oh, sure. So my mother is from Huntington on Long Island. She worked as a teacher's assistant in early education with children with severe autism. And my father is from Southbridge also. He was born and raised there. And he worked for the Massachusetts Turnpike Authority. It's a toll road that runs through the middle of Massachusetts. And he worked there most of his career. He worked up his way up from like a ditch digger to middle management there. Later on in his career, he managed the buildings and the toll booths back when there were people in those booths.
And so now for you growing up, did you go to school all through Southbridge?
Yep. It was the small public school experience with, some inspired teachers, some not. And then I took a break between high school and college. And I basically, when I was 25, I went to UMass Amherst. And I stayed there through graduate school.
But just to go back a bit.
Oh, sure.
How would you describe Southbridge and the neighborhood?
Oh, well, it was a small town that was a really thriving industrial center back in the 1800s into the early 1900s. And when, by the time I was there, all the highways missed it, so it was sort of declining. The factories were closing, and it was a kind of left out of the progress of, the interstates and all of that. So it was a nice little town, but certainly not in its heyday when I grew up.
And what activities would you do as a child growing up in the area?
Well, anything outdoors. I wanted to catch anything I could catch: frogs, salamanders, insects, to look at them. I loved any kind of arts and crafts. We did, just things in the house, making things, riding bikes.
And also for school, more so in high school, what were you interested in subject-wise, and were you interested in planning at that time?
I didn't know about planning. It was nothing that was on my radar. I really loved animals. I loved and anything science.
Mm-hmm.
I liked writing, so English was a good topic for me. And I wanted to be a veterinarian. That's what I really wanted to be.
Coming out of high school?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And you went to UMass Amherst?
Well, I took a little break, so when I got really interested in music right after high school, and I learned about audio engineering and live sound production. So I learned like how to use microphones and amplifiers and speakers to make a live band sound good. So like pop music, rock music. So I got involved with that, but it's a pretty hard life, and that's why I ended up going to college after a few years of that.
And what was your major for UMass Amherst?
So UMass Amherst, when I went to school, I started in zoology because I was interested in the veterinarian track, but then I discovered wildlife biology, which really got me interested in endangered species, and that was what I was really excited about early in my college career.
And what were you thinking now after graduating, after doing bachelor's?
Well, the master's went towards something called conservation biology, which kind of was more bigger picture than just endangered species. Thinks about preserving habitat, not just the animal itself, but like how do you preserve its habitat. And I had this job it was more like an internship in between like one summer where I worked. The job itself didn't inspire a changing course, but what another person there was doing inspired a changing course. That person was buying land to preserve it. And they had this great map on the wall that showed in green all the spots that this person had worked to preserve. And that really got me excited because I thought, wow, if you just save the land, then you've saved all this habitat. So that led me to think about what I wanted to do after college, which was something along those lines.
Mm-hmm. And how did you make your way to Long Island? We might be skipping over some parts.
Well, yeah, so a lot of all the schooling and the first, that experience was all in Massachusetts. And then it was, I'm graduated, I have my master's, and I'm excited about land preservation, so I looked into the Nature Conservancy because they were doing that a lot back then. We're talking early 2000s, late 90s, early 2000s. So I applied to the Nature Conservancy anywhere I could, and one of the jobs I applied for was on Long Island, and I got that job. So that's how I came to Long Island. My first job out of college.
Wow. And what did that job entail?
Well, it was on the East End down in East Hampton, and it entailed working with the Nature Conservancy, working with local governments to preserve land. So that was my job, was find land to preserve, convince the landowner to do it, and then figure out how to fund it. And I was really lucky because I arrived at that job right when the East End received or passed the Community Preservation Fund law. And that was the transfer tax to fund land preservation. So I was involved in the earliest Community Preservation Fund land purchases.
Wow.
Yeah, it was exciting.
And what was that time frame that you were working there?
I was there 99 to 2004. 2003.
And what was your next step from there?
Well, what that job showed me was the enormous impact that local government has on how land is used. That's where I was introduced to the idea of planning was understanding, you know, because Nature Conservancy wasn't buying all this land. They were just helping facilitate government spending on land preservation, because that's where that money goes. It goes to the local government, and local government spends it. So that's where I was introduced to planning. My next job was with Brookhaven Town, where I was doing land preservation again, but also working with the planners there and getting more acquainted with planning, and eventually having the title of Assistant Town Planning Director. So it was in Brookhaven Town where I learned much more about planning. I was encouraged to become a licensed planner. So I studied about planning, and I worked with through the American Institute of Certified Planners to become certified as a planner. I use the word licensed, but it's actually certification.
Okay. And now that you were on Long Island, had you visited the North Fork?
Well, interestingly, so I started out on Long Island on the South Fork, and then I moved to the North Fork because, so when I worked in Brookhaven, I actually lived in Cutchogue because I found the North Fork to be culturally much more like New England, where I'm from, than the South Fork. And so I felt very at home here and comfortable.
And so what year was that you had moved to Cutchogue?
Yeah, 2004.
Okay.
Yeah. When you could still rent a house for a reasonable amount of money year round.
Yes. And now moving forward, how did the opportunity come about for your current job as a town planner?
Well, I think I was very lucky. My direct boss at the town of Brookhaven was recruited for the job originally, but geographically it wasn't going to work out for him. So he suggested me for the job. I was already living in Cutchogue, as I said, and I knew that Southold town was a better fit for me than Brookhaven was. It's a lot more, like I said, like New England, and I think the emphasis here on preserving the small town character and the quality of life, it really appealed to me, and I wanted to be part of that.
And now getting started within your job, that was 2000.
So I started here as the planning director in Southold Town in 2007.
And what were your main goals, or just in terms of what the town was expecting of you starting that role, and what were the main goals you were working on initially in your job?
That's a good question.
Or what were you tasked with working on initially?
Well, as a planning director, you know, your job is to manage the work you do for the planning board. So there's a department with planners and other staff that work to support the planning board. So the most immediate work was seeing that the application process was running smoothly. You have applications come in for new buildings, you know, commercial site plans. You have applications coming in for subdivisions. People want to create more lots on their land. And so one emphasis I had was looking for places to become more efficient, set up some new systems. The department, you know, had been running for many years, and technology was changing pretty fast. So trying to find ways to use technology to make the systems more efficient was definitely one of the early goals I had.
And you mentioned a bit about what you do within that job, but could you describe a little bit? You mentioned your job is also to bring items to the planning board and convey what the information is that, or applications or recommendations that you might have to the planning board. But are there any other roles you have within the job that people might not know that you do as the Southold Town planner?
Well, the planning department also provides support to the town board. So when the town board's considering a new local law, say to change something about the zoning code, we're very involved in the process of that, helping to research it, helping to look up, what do other places do, helping to do something called modeling, where if they want to change a parameter in the zoning, what's that going to look like? So, we have a lot of skills on that end as far as providing a lot of information to the decision makers.
And could you describe what a typical workday looks like for you?
Sure. I mean, one of the things I love about the job is there's no day's the same as the last. There's a lot of interesting things to do. There's always something different happening. There's always a challenge. But typically, we start early. We open at 8 a.m. Early for me. But I personally always have a lot of emails. So I usually spend some time first thing just checking out the emails, doing some answering. Oftentimes there's a meeting or two scheduled with a landowner or someone who wants to develop a property and they want to know, what the zoning says and what they can and can't do on their property. So that's a typical day. We'll have, if it's a planning board day, we'll have to go to the planning board meeting with the rest of the staff, and we present staff reports at those meetings. A lot of times we do a PowerPoint to present the information. So that's another thing we're good at, is making PowerPoints and presentations. There's a lot of reports that get written. I'm either writing them or reviewing them from other people. There's a lot of phone calls, so I'm on the phone a lot, either answering a call or making a call with people who are applying, developers, neighbors of landowners who are wondering what's going on.
Does it vary? Would you say there's a busier time of the year, or it can vary? In terms
I think
of maybe
it's always busy, but the type of work changes depending on the year. So time of year. So there'll be lulls in when the public's coming in a lot, say around Christmas time, or, I always find that August, especially the end of August, it gets very quiet on the phones, but we have a lot of other things going on that we're catching up on or doing. Yes. So it just shifts. The type of work shifts.
Now, for the Southold's comprehensive plan, could you walk us through that development process, and when were they starting to talk about doing that? Was that in 2009, 2010, or earlier?
Well, I understand they were talking about doing it even before I started in 2007, because it was long overdue. But we really seriously got started on it in 2010. The end of 2010, to be fair, because I don't want people to think it took us 10 whole years. It was less than 10. And that's part of a typical day too, is fitting in that sort of work, the big picture work, in amongst the everyday, more immediate, short-term, I call it the short-term planning items. These are the long-term planning work items, like comprehensive plan. So yeah, that's about when it started. I'd say it was October 2010.
I'm trying to think, because I wasn't living on Long Island at the time, but I noticed, were there other towns or cities starting to work on comprehensive plans, or even finishing them up, if other places were starting around the same time?
I can't remember all the years. I know East Hampton, when I was with Nature Conservancy, was working on an update to their plan, and they had some stops and starts, but I think they eventually finished. I'm not certain about that. I know during the time we were working on ours, Southampton started up, as well as Brookhaven Town. I don't think Brookhaven Town finished anything. I think Southampton did eventually. But I may not have my facts straight on that. It's a hard thing to do, and I know Riverhead's been working, and they've done some of the work. I know they've completed some of the work on a plan update.
And looking through that process, what were some of the biggest challenges and successes over that time?
Well, one of the things we were really set upon doing was writing it in-house. So rather than hiring a consultant, having seen other towns struggle with a consultant and really wanting our town view on, in the writing of the plan, the creation of the plan. I think that was one of the biggest challenges because all the other work the planning department was already doing, now we had to find time to do this massive project, which we did do, but that's why it took us, 9.5 years was we had to fit this in to all the other work. And we did it. I mean, we did this in-house. We didn't hire a consultant to write most of it. We did hire in 2 places where we needed outside expertise. That was the economic chapter and the transportation chapter. But I'd say that was one of the biggest challenges.
I think was important and even more unique in that I think a lot of other towns or cities do tend to go to a consulting firm to gather and provide a lot of the written writing, and it can be more generalized and not within what Southold Town wants to do. But were you gathering a lot of the data and writing a lot of the wording throughout the comprehensive plan?
Oh, yes. I mean, yes, definitely.
The majority of it?
Well, I wouldn't say, there was a team of us, so it wasn't just me. I did do an awful lot of writing. Mark Terry, our assistant town planning director, also did, took on some chapters and wrote them. It was definitely a team effort. The planning board was there the whole time, working on the edits, and
And what were some of the successes coming out of the comprehensive plan?
I think the biggest was the amount of public input we were able to gather. I think we had something like 64 public input meetings over the course of that time on each chapter. Each chapter had several meetings, and we took that public input and we incorporated it into the plan. And the other big success was that we finished it, which I think if you looked into it, you'd find other towns maybe weren't able to do that.
And initially starting it, say, the end of 2010, and then finishing it by 2019. You were working on it through that whole time, but how do you make sure that you update along the way over almost that decade and make sure that, what we were thinking in 2010 or 2011, we might have had to change later on within some of the zoning or code language or mapping of land use? I
mean, the way we wrote it, we were definitely monitoring that as we went and making sure the latest, like, for instance, we saved the land use chapter, which had a lot of data about land use and build out analyses for last, so that was the most up to date, because it was very important for that to be the most up to date. And we monitored the rest to make sure, are we still on track here? So we made sure. The last step we took was to edit the entire plan, and we did hire a consultant to do the graphic design and do some copy editing. So, having a professional copy editor and graphic design, I think we had a grant for that as well, which was great. And that's, I think, what makes it was a good plan already, but it makes it a really great plan because it's visually appealing, easy to use, and the professional editing helped make sure it was concise and easy to read.
And just looking through the plan, there's a lot of data and numbers. How did you go about gathering all that information and putting it into an accessible format for people to see a clear idea, whether it was through the age population or traffic accidents and other information like that?
Well, I definitely had a vision of I wanted it to be easy and use graphics to show these things. I don't have the expertise to create those, so the graphic design helped us take the data we had gotten, a lot of it from the census work that gets done. Something called American Community Survey that's updated every couple of years. A lot of those demographics come from that. And so it was, the consultants helped us make them look good. If that's what you're asking. I mean, we gathered the data, but the consultants helped us make it look good and easy to understand.
And now, moving to more current topics within the town of Southold and the planning department. Southold faces, well, I think it has been facing increasing development pressures. But how does the planning department balance the need for growth with the preservation of the town's character and environment, and also taking into account development?
Well, there's two aspects to what we deal with in planning. One is what I call the short-term planning items. So somebody owns a piece of property, they make an application to develop it. The zoning code allows the development. So, now you're looking at that proposal and trying to make sure there is a balance there. They have a right to develop it, but they don't have a right to impinge on the quality of life of somebody maybe who lives next door. So, there's little things that the planning board can do, like make sure there's a buffer if there's a house next door and there's a big building going up, or maybe that building should be a little farther away from the property line, or maybe that building should be not as tall as proposed. There's a lot of work on that balance in the State Environmental Quality Review Act. So every planning board decision requires a review under that. The shorthand is SECRA. That's the acronym. So when you hear SECRA, that is the environmental review of any project. And that's where, for the short-term planning items like subdivision and site plan applications, that's largely where the balance test comes into play, where you're balancing out what are the impacts of this project versus community character, quality of life, environmental resources, that sort of thing. The bigger picture, that's why we're working on a zoning update. The development pressures are concerning, and one of the main goals in our comprehensive plan was to update our zoning to make it more modern, to respond to, what pressures are happening now, and also to make it easier to use, because our code hasn't been holistically updated since 1989. So we've done a lot of little zoning updates to pieces of it, but looking at the big picture of it hasn't been done for a long time, and it's overdue. The town board 2 years ago funded a zoning update project with $200,000 in the budget. And the town hired a consultant to help us with that because we knew we'd need help. It's a lot of technical work. So we hired a consultant, and they've been working on that project. We've gone to the public about it. So we had a series of public meetings back in March where we met with all the hamlets. The civic associations hosted these meetings. They wanted the public to know more about the project, and so did we. So we hosted informational meetings where we also took input from people about any zoning ideas they had or concerns they had.
And in regards to when you do get applications and development proposals, initially, I mean, you have to be neutral in the sense that you take the development plan and analyze it, and do you talk with the developer or applicant and then bring it to the planning board and give your, do you provide just the information, or do you say that this, obviously if it's something that doesn't fit in that the zoning of that, say it is residential but they want to put marine business or something different there, would you still accept the the application, or say, well, it doesn't fit within that zoning, or do you bring that to the planning board and then recommend that you give your recommendation? And obviously there can be rezoning, but I was just curious how.
So that's a great question. There's a team of people involved in a really early evaluation of any plan that comes in. That includes planning department and also our building department and our chief building inspector, who is also the zoning administrator, and who can say, you know what, this is not a permitted use in our zone, in that zoning district. So oftentimes, well, every commercial site plan application has something called a pre-submission meeting. So they haven't even submitted an application yet. They come in and they meet with a team of town staff where we review with them the town code to see if their proposal meets the code, and to let them know, okay, by the way, it doesn't meet the code here or there. And we basically, we're evaluating it, I would say, neutrally. You know, we don't insert our opinions. We just let them know, you know, through our experience, if what they have is going to be able to be considered. Because some things, like you said, if it's not even allowed in the zone, it wouldn't even be considered. It wouldn't even make it to the planning board because it's not allowed in the zone. It would get stopped by the building department saying, you need to go get either a change of zone or a variance on the use, which is hard to get because you have to prove you can't use the property for anything else.
Now, with some of the zoning updates, and that's still in the process.
Yes.
But what's the outcome in terms of, it's more finalizing new zoning districts, or is it also changing the wording within the codes as well, and how the process of it might move the process along faster, say with approving zoning changes or approving planning projects?
So the zoning update project consists of a zoning consultant who is hired by the town. He's professional, does this. He's a planner and an attorney. That company is called ZoneCo. They are working with your town planning staff, including me, to do several things with our zoning code. They are updating the code language itself. They're reorganizing it to make it clearer and easier to understand. They are looking at all the definitions and the lists of uses, and they're, you know, updating those, modernizing those, consolidating those where they can. They're also going to look at the zoning map and where these zoning districts are laid out on the ground. Do they make sense? Do they need to be changed at all? We're not looking at a wholesale big changes to zoning districts. We're not thinking about, you know, changing people's zone in a large way. I think we're looking more at tweaking the zoning to make it better for businesses. We're also looking at the development process, which is contained in the zoning code, trying to make that better and easier for local businesses to get through a site plan process, for example. So that's the gist. And the timing is, you know, they're in the middle of it. We're in the thick of it right now. And we plan to come back to the public with whatever's proposed in the early stage so that people can look at it, both, you know, people who live here, people who have businesses here, everyone will get a chance to give their input and have an effect on it. It's not going to be a done deal when we come out with it. It's going to be, here's our draft of it. What does everyone think?
Mm-hmm. And in terms of community involvement within the planning process, you mentioned even with this zoning update, how you've engaged with residents of Southold. And were there any other ways that the department engages with residents to ensure their voices are heard and considered in the planning decision?
Yes. When the planning board is reviewing applications, each application typically has a public hearing. So that's a place where a person who's concerned about it can come to the planning board and stand up and explain their concerns to the board. And the board listens to those and always considers those. We added, after COVID, a Zoom option, so people who can't make it in person can attend those hearings via Zoom. We also always take written comments from people, so people could email us. They can give us a phone call, but usually we need it in writing. So an email works. We still get handwritten letters, and those get put into our record. And that's just for applications. When you're talking about the bigger picture things like the zoning update, we will do in-person, like public workshops or charrettes, they call them. But we're also exploring how to create an online engagement process so people that don't have time to come to a meeting can engage and review and provide comments online. And we're trying to come up with some other ideas as well. So we take that very seriously. I think the being very transparent and the public having every opportunity to know what's going on is really important.
Even just through possibly even doing surveys or comments.
Well, interestingly enough, I think it's interesting, our zoning update project has its own website. And when we started that website, we did do a survey. We may do another survey in the future. And
then looking at what role does technology play in the planning process, and could you provide any examples of, well, actually, I should just ask you the one question first, because I was going to ask about the GIS.
Well, that
mapping.
Would be part of the answer. So
yeah. Can you provide examples of how GIS mapping and other tools are used to enhance planning and decision making?
Sure. So, I think every day I'm using maps. And those are most of the ones I use are created using GIS, Geographic Information Systems, computer mapping. It's a necessary tool that we use constantly. If you go on the town website, you can click on a little thing that says maps, and in there's all sorts of maps the public can use. There's one called Tax Map Inquiry and Zoning, where you can type in an address and you can see the zoning on that property, and you can see the tax map number, you can see other information we have listed for that. I personally learned how to use GIS when I was in college, so I still use it quite a bit myself to look things up. We have something called ArcMap, which is our GIS system, and we have John Stepanowski, who's our GIS wizard. He maintains all our data, and we look to him for a lot of help with information we need.
And what initiatives are in place to attract and support small businesses within Southold town?
Well, we were really cognizant of that when we wrote the economic chapter of the comprehensive plan. We were just coming out of the last big recession when we wrote that. And you can see that when you read that chapter, you can see that was definitely a concern. We have had, even before that, something called an economic development committee in the town. And they're composed of local business owners that are concerned about just what that, how do you enhance and retain and attract, small local business. It doesn't have to be small, but, you want local businesses to survive and you want people to want to do business here. So that committee works on ways to do that and, works on how do we implement the goals for that from our plan. We had last March when the civics were hosting informational meetings about the zoning update. The Chambers of Commerce did the same thing. So we went to a combined meeting of the Mattituck and North Fork Chambers to present and hear people's issues on zoning. And the Economic Development Committee held a forum where we also discussed to a wider audience of local businesses what our zoning update was about and listened to their concerns. The other way we're hoping to attract and enhance and support local business is through our zoning update. So we're hoping any changes we make to the zoning actually help local businesses. By, one of the ways it can help is streamlining and making our development application process easier, the site plan process easier, and also making sure that the uses that are listed in our zoning match the types of uses that local businesses need and can do in their whatever zoning district they're in.
What are some of the most significant regulatory challenges your department faces, and how do you navigate them?
I guess I want to know what you mean by regulatory challenges.
Are there limitations in what you can regulate within the planning department, and how, if there's limitations on, say, what you would really want for certain areas in Southold Town, whether for affordable housing, just in terms of limitations on that, you're limited in terms of just saying this can be residential, or was there another term within the zoning or land use, HALO, halo?
Oh, yeah.
Where that could be a residential business that could possibly be used for affordable housing. But in terms of really, are there limitations in that regard? Because you
mean in our current zoning code? Like, is something holding us back from achieving some of our goals?
Yes.
Okay. Well, yes. I mean, again, I'll just talk about the zoning update. Our code needs a lot of updates around housing to make it easier for us to end up with more housing that is attainable to people who are already living here in our community who can't afford it or can't find it. I won't get into details because I don't have them off the top of my head, but there are certainly challenges in the way the code's written now that are, basically obstacles to that happening that I think we can clear up and make much better in this zoning update work we're doing now.
And just looking ahead, what are the biggest challenges Southold faces in terms of planning and development and future development?
Well, certainly housing is a huge challenge. I've been here living in this town for 20 years, and I've seen the drastic change even in that time. It's I was lucky I was able to buy a house, but before that, I was renting here for many years, and you could, and now it's next to impossible. And then buying a house is impossible for most people. So I think that's the challenge, is how do we maintain our community here, and how do we find a way to have enough housing to maintain a real working community, because that's big. I mean, I lived on the South Fork for a while, and I saw the same thing play out there 20 years ago, over 20 years ago. So it's definitely happening here, and the steps we take in the near future are really going to help determine the outcome.
Mm-hmm. And I had another question related to preservation, and obviously there's a balance with we need affordable housing, but balancing the need for open space and preservation and the character of the area, but then also the need for housing or workforce housing, but also doing it in a way that's creating less sprawl and suburbanization, and making even, and this probably comes into play with the planning, but condensing it within the hamlets more, making it more walkable and public transit oriented development, but then also not losing the character with building too high or too close to the street. So I was curious what your thoughts are on that, and moving forward with the town and how that is a challenge but could be accomplished.
Yeah, I mean, there's a thing called smart growth, which
Yes.
is what you just described.
Yeah.
I don't like buzzwords, but that's we think along those lines. We think along, how do you reuse a big empty building, and we're working on some projects along those lines right now. How do you take this big empty building that no one's going to use for anything else and make it into apartments? How does our code allow it? Do we need to change the code to allow that sort of thing? I mean, those, infill, adaptive reuse, keeping, anything higher density in the hamlet center or close to it so it's walkable. Those are definitely the priorities when you think about how do you get some more attainable housing for people. And even just, the word housing, has for some people a real negative connotation, but we're talking about, even for people like me, I couldn't afford to move here now, which is sad. My point is just, that is, I think, the overarching goal when we talk about attainable housing is how do you, if you're going to do something at a higher density, keep it near the hamlet center. We're very committed to keeping our maximum height at the 2 stories, so I don't think, we don't have sewers here. I don't think you're ever going to see 5-story buildings anywhere in Southold. It's just doesn't ever seem like that would happen. Certainly not anything we want to happen. We're thinking about, when we think about attainable housing, we're really thinking a lot, not just about rentals, but also how do we get people into home ownership. So, we're hoping to move in that direction as much as we can. And again, trying to keep that in places where it makes sense. Don't develop the farmland, develop, closer in where there's already development.
And in regards to farmland and agricultural zoning spaces, can those be adjusted, or because is there residential 40 and residential 80? Because I see that on the land use, but then on the zoning it says residential. Is that still, in terms of future development, there can't be a subdivision built on that, even though it says residential 80?
Well, I can clear that up for you. So zoning says what you can do on the property. So you can have a property zoned residential 80, which means if you were going to subdivide it, each lot has to be a minimum of 80,000 square feet. But just because that zoning there, in that zoning district, you're also allowed to have a farm. So you can farm there, but you could change your mind someday and develop it. We have a lot of programs in place to assist a landowner with not developing it. We have the land preservation program where we will buy the development rights from the farm so they can make some money from the land and still keep it a farm. There's something called a conservation subdivision where someone can develop just a few lots and keep most of it the farm, and they get paid for preserving most of it as a farm. So those are the mechanisms in place to, even though the zoning says you can develop it residentially, it's less likely that would happen. We don't have a zone that specifically just says agriculture. And you can see the town, if you look at a preserved land map, the town's been very successful in preserving farmland and limiting the amount of development that happens.
Mm-hmm. And with your experience as a town planner within the planning department, what advice would you give to young professionals interested in a career in urban and regional planning?
I think my best advice would be to like the place where you end up working, especially if you work in government as a planner. Because if you really like the place and believe in it, it'll make your job very enjoyable.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting because I was more so going into college, I was interested in urban planning.
Oh, yeah.
But I was hesitant about it, and in regards to public speaking and also having the interacting with the public and just conflicts that might come up. So I was thinking of even architecture, but I enjoyed the planning and the maps part. So I appreciate talking to you about planning and someone who is a planner in the town.
Oh, yeah, thank you. I am not a natural public speaker. I would avoid it if I could. But I've had to do it so much that I've gotten more comfortable with it.
Yes.
But there's a lot of it involved.
And then now with your time living and working on the North Fork, what have you enjoyed most about your experience and Southold town?
I mean, there's all the obvious things, the beaches and the water and the farms and just that great small town feel. But I think for me, it's been the community and being part of a community. It's a great feeling to be part of something like this. You know, I think I dreaded all the public meetings I had to do at first, and now that's my favorite part of the job is going out to the community and hearing what people have to say and everybody participating. Mm-hmm. It's a good feeling.
And I just ask at the end if there was anything else you'd like to say or discuss that we haven't talked about.
I think just, if this comes out before the fall, I would say I really hope people get involved in this zoning update project. Even if you're in the village, it should be interesting. But also, anywhere in Southold town, from Orient all the way to Laurel, this project will affect people. And I don't think people understand how zoning affects them. Even if, I'll just give an example. You live in a neighborhood and your neighbor puts up a big separate garage that looms over your backyard. Well, it's zoning that affects how tall that building can be, how close to the property line it can be, and how they use it. So, I think everybody should have some interest in zoning and what we're going to be doing with our zoning update.
Yes, I mean, it definitely shapes the future of the area, and I think it is important for people to get involved in that.
Yes. So the website is southoldzoningupdate.com.
Yes. Everyone should get involved.
Yes.
And provide your opinions and support the future of Southold. So I want to thank you so much for taking the time to come in today and share your story and your passion for the North Fork and really all the wonderful work you're doing with shaping the future of Southold. So I want to thank you so much for coming in today.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me.
Well, I hope you enjoyed episode 95 with Heather Lanza I want to thank you for listening to the Floyd Memorial Library podcast, and we'll see you next time.